Later, I said to Andy, "That's why Martha's the way that she is today. You should have just let her run into the Bronx." And he said, "She would have gotten hurt." And I said, "But you never allow her to suffer the consequences of one single thing she ever does." Martha does whatever it takes to get what she wants, and that can involve some pretty strange behavior. She could have gotten killed that night. Martha's actions didn't come as a complete surprise to Andy and to the friends that he later told about the incident. During the years of the Stewarts' marriage, Martha occasionally threatened suicide if she didn't get her way, and Andy always gave in. Martha's tantrum in the Bronx worked. Andy gave her the time that she required, and her book party came off as planned. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We're going to keep going with the Martha Stewart book today. You'll remember that last time we read, Martha Stewart's really building her brand. She has lots of connections with other magazines. She's, writing for different magazines. She's working on, she's a food editor for one magazine, and she's got her catering business is really booming. She's got, recognizable clients that come to her. But of course, last time we also discussed that she's got some questionable ethics when it comes to how she's doing this catering job. Oftentimes, if she's invited to a party or a photo shoot, she'll scoop all the food up from the party or from the photo shoot after it's done, and then just take it with her to use that food for a catering job. If she sees leftover wine at different events, she'll take it and then sort of reconstitute it for something else. She'll make some vinegar out of it. I mean, she's not even above pouring the leftover wine from people's glasses into another jar and then taking it home and using that for, in one instance, she made homemade vinegar and put that in gift baskets for Ralph Lauren that Ralph Lauren had contracted her to make for, various people. Yuck. I mean, that's super embarrassing. But anyway, that's kind of what she's about. She'll cut corners. She'll cut you. She's just rather into getting ahead at any cost. So today, we're going to remember who she is. We're going to remember what we've learned about her. And now she's jumping into the world of books. Now, of course, this is really going to end up being Martha Stewart's bread and butter. This is what she's going to be known for. Is these great big coffee table books that sort of usher you into a realm unknown to you, you poor peasant. And she's going to write a book called Entertaining, and it is going to run the gamut on all the things that you need to know to be a great hostess. Now, as I've said many a time, Martha Stewart knows what she's about. She's got great tips and tricks. Very, very knowledgeable. But as in all of these stories, while the end product might be pretty spectacular, getting there is a mess, and she's difficult and she's hard to get along with, and everyone hates her by the end of the project. But she does produce a good product. So that's kind of that's the struggle when it comes to Martha Stewart. It'd be so much easier if what she was doing was just total junk. We might have realized who she was beforehand. Now, let's read this first chapter entitled Entertaining. Of course, this was the title of her first book, but it is a complete and total mess. All the behind-the-scene things and the way she's screwing folks over in order to get this product off the ground. The book says that whatever Martha Stewart's business practices, she continued to generate lucrative jobs with fancy clients. Parties ranging from a dozen or so for an intimate dinner to hundreds for a corporate bash, raking in big bucks in the process. Friends helped her along the way. A neighbor who was director of the American Institute of Graphic Arts, for instance, hired her for an event, which resulted in a lucrative contract with the Cooper Hewitt Museum. Another such affair turned out for Martha, much like the legendary Hollywood story about Lana Turner's discovery by a producer at Schwab's drugstore on Sunset Boulevard. In Martha's case, she was catering a party for an Abrams book when a powerful publishing colleague of Andy's discovered her making omelets and thought, "Honey, I'm going to make you a star." Following the enormous success of Gnomes, Andy published another beautiful fantasy book called Fairies by Brian Froud. In order to launch it properly, he hired Martha to plan and throw a party that the publishing world would not soon forget. While Andy's boss at Times Mirror wouldn't allow him to publish a book by Martha, he saw no conflict of interest in her making about catering parties for the house. Martha surpassed even herself with the Fairies soiree, which was thrown in December 1978. A party so memorable that 4 years later, the New York Times was still raving about it as the most unusual Stewart-catered Christmas party. The setting was the U.S. Customs House in Lower Manhattan, which Martha and her crew transformed into a magical fairy tale forest, with hundreds of evergreen trees sparkling with tiny lights, and with the pretty young women on Martha's staff as fairies. At the witching hour, 1,000 guests, including the heads of all the major publishing houses, senior editors, publicists, and executives from the major book chains, were served omelets filled with red caviar or cheese or vegetables. Andy, the book's publisher, was as usual pressed into service by Martha to help. He was with the group, whipping up the eggs. What is that? What is that? This is Andy's launch party for his book. This is not Martha, go get Andy and make him help in the kitchen. Why was she so controlling and mean to him? Why couldn't she just let him have his moment? She's having a moment with a great party. Why does she have to try to steal his thunder? He needs to be mixing and mingling with all of these, important people that he's invited to this party, but instead she's got him back in the back. Andy, I said mix those eggs and mix them faster and not that way. Is that the whip you're using? Do I have to do everything myself? I won't do everything myself. I'm busy making sure that this show is running. But if I have to come back here again and tell you how to mix those eggs, so help me God, I'll break your face. Well, but anyway, the party's going off. Because Alan Merkin, president of the Crown Publishing Group, which encompassed a number of publishing imprints, was duly impressed. Merkin had known Andy for several years and considered him a colleague and friend. But Merkin had never socialized with the Stewarts and didn't know Martha was Betty Crocker. I was lucky to be there that night, Merkin noted years later. It was an extraordinary party, and I was smitten by what I saw. When I was talking to Andy during the evening, I said, "Who's your caterer? This is terrific." Martha came over, and she had all these cornrows in her hair. She looked great. What? Cornrows? And Andy said, "You have to meet my wife. She's the caterer." I said to her, "I think you should do a book." And Martha said she wasn't quite ready, but she thought she would be soon. I thought here we obviously had somebody who was very talented. The food was very good, very different looking, and the whole package of the party was incredible. So I felt she had book potential in her. I was lucky that I was in the right place and made the right suggestion. Merkin also felt confident that Martha could produce a publishable manuscript because Andy, whose business savvy and artistic creativity he trusted implicitly, would be heavily involved in the project. That fact, combined with Martha's promotable talents, good looks, an articulate and bright personal style, made him believe that he'd have another best-selling author in his stable. Meanwhile, Martha's friend Mary Emmerling was ready to do a book. Emmerling had already researched and written an outline for a book about American country style that had become so popular, as underscored by the enormous success of Joanne Barwick's Country Living magazine. Because of her friendship with Martha, Emmerling first pitched the book to Andy on the sand at Bridgehampton one weekend when the Stewarts were house guests. But Andy rejected the idea out of hand. He said, "We don't do that kind of book. You'd be better off at Potter," Emmerling recalled. Potter was the publishing house of Clarkson and Potter, a division of Crown, which was headed by Merkin. Potter had just published the best-selling style book High Tech by Joan Crone and Suzanne Slesson. Because High Tech was so high tech, said Emmerling later, Potter was looking for a book on country, something soft to counteract high tech. I had my tear sheets from Country Living, and I had all the business cards from every antique show I'd ever been to. I put together a quick outline, so I had the book. In 1980, Potter published Emmerling's American Country, a style and source book, which became an overnight sensation, the first of an enormously successful series of books by Emmerling, who earned the title The High Priestess of Country. Martha was really pissed, a mutual friend of theirs said. She was jealous that Mary was doing something Martha desperately wanted to do. Around the time Emmerling got her first book deal, Martha catered a party for another of Andy's coffee table books, Broadway musicals. Once again, Merkin was on the guest list for the event and was knocked out by Martha's work, even though the bash was held in Macy's basement, the cellar. "We should really talk seriously about doing that book," he told her. This time, Martha said she was ready. During intense negotiations, Andy secured an advance from Martha on the order of $35,000, a royalty of about 7%, a photography budget, and other benefits usually offered to a published author. Andy naturally knew all the ins and outs of the book game, and being a pal of Merkin's, he was able to secure a good deal for Martha's highly speculative first book. Martha never would have become Martha without Andy's help. But when Martha presented her first outline to Entertaining to the editors at Clarkson Potter, they were appalled. "It was so daunting," recalled Carol Southern, the publisher. "She had omelets for 200 and cocktail parties for 100. It was all so huge. We said, 'Martha, we'd love to do this, but we need to try to make it a book for the home cook.' And so with great difficulty, we sort of managed to persuade her to alter some of the quantities because she was really thinking big parties." If Andy couldn't publish Martha's books, the Crown Publishing Group was next best. It was an aggressive company founded in 1933 in the midst of the Depression by Alan Merkin's uncle, Nate Wartels, who had built a reputation as a master merchandiser with a simple but successful philosophy: offer your customers good value for their money. At Turkey Hill, Martha and Andy began planning the book, which they agreed would contain a great many photographs and lots of recipes, all gathered, cataloged, and documented over the past couple of years during catering jobs. The book would be called Entertaining, even though the Stewarts weren't certain at that point whether the title accurately reflected what Martha wanted to convey to readers. She wasn't sure whether to the public entertaining meant going out to see a Broadway show or having a magician come to the house. Martha, however, believed it meant entertaining people in one's home with good food and in style. But her vision wasn't immediately obvious to everyone involved in the project. Its title notwithstanding, Entertaining would be, to all intents and purposes, a cookbook, albeit one more sumptuously produced than any other in the past, with gorgeous color photographs of food printed on expensive paper. Still, it would follow the tradition of a genre that dated back to the Learned Banquet, a treatise on food and food preparation written in the 2nd century BC by Athanasius, a Greek gourmet. The treatise was presented in the form of a dialogue between two banqueters, who talked for days and related recipes for such dishes as stuffed vine leaves and several varieties of cheesecake. Medieval Europe also produced cookbooks. Among the earliest in English was The Form of Curry. The word curry meant cooked food. Compiled in the 12th century. It consisted of 196 recipes, many of which revealed their French origins. One of the first French cookbooks, called Les Ménages de Paris, was published in 1394 and contained recipes for such delicacies as frogs and snails. The printing press revolutionized the culinary arts by making cookbooks widely available. The first known to have been printed in 1485 was produced by an Italian, who mainly recorded recipes for marzipans and other sweets. Cookbooks proliferated as the rising middle class gained interest in better food preparation. The first cookbook written by a woman was Hannah Woolley's The Queen-like Closet, or Rich Cabinet, published in 1670. The secrets of French cuisine were made available to a wide public by the cookbooks of great chefs like Alexis Soyer, whose Shilling Cookery for the People sold more than 100,000 copies. One of the most successful and popular cookbooks of all time was produced in the United States in 1896, when Fannie Merritt Farmer took on the editorship of the Boston Cooking School cookbook. Farmer was the first to standardize the methods of measurements of her recipes, assuring reliable results to her readers. The 20th century saw a prodigious burst of interest in cooking. In the early 1920s, for example, the Washburn Crosby Company, which was in the flour milling business, invented Betty Crocker, a fictitious homemaker and cook, to answer consumer letters. In the late 20s, through a corporate merger, Crocker became a logo of General Mills, and her name and face quickly became synonymous with cookbooks and cake mixes. For decades, Crocker was one of America's most widely known food advisors. By the late 70s, a cookbook revolution was abroad in the land, and Martha saw herself as an uber Betty Crocker, who wanted to reach the masses, not just the sophisticated wealthy. She saw herself as a presence in supermarkets, and was thinking about eventually doing something on a very broad, multi-volume scale, such as the how-to books that Time Life produced. Martha, who felt strongly that she could be a tastemaker, had chosen a perfect time in history to produce Entertaining. As a prominent food critic and writer, Richard Sachs, who played a key role in the literary scandal surrounding Entertaining after its publication, observed later, Martha did Entertaining at the exact epicenter, the exact moment when things were bursting out all over the place in the food world. Everybody and his brother were publishing a cookbook. There were suddenly 4 food magazines instead of 1 or 2. There were cooking classes. There was cooking trips. The food revolution was happening in terms of people being exposed to new and different kinds of cooking. And this really was the beginning of the height of a golden age of food, so Martha was in the right place at the right time with the right idea. Though the Stewarts' marriage continued to be on shaky ground and Andy continued to be the dough that Martha loved to pound, he generously acted as her agent, editorial director, lawyer, chief negotiator, and majordomo, all with the hope that success from the book might finally exorcise whatever demons had possessed her through their years together and make life happier for both of them. Don't get your hopes up, Andy. Next chapter, entitled The Ghost and Mrs. Stewart. And here is the story of how Martha screws over yet another friend, pretty egregiously. The book says that with Martha's deal signed, the most important issue still to be resolved before work could proceed was finding someone to write Entertaining. Alan Merkin had greenlighted a project with a first-time author who could never have turned in a publishable manuscript on her own. Andy felt strongly that Martha needed a professional writer, and she readily agreed. She hated writing. Besides, she had her booming catering business to oversee. But as one longtime pal asserted, Martha paints her own landscape and walks in it. With the book contract in hand, Martha presented herself as a writer to the world. Mrs. Stewart carries her IBM typewriter from room to room and from her home to an adjacent studio building, depending on her mood, the New York Times reported in a profile. Described by the Times reporter as an energetic writer, Martha was quoted as saying, "If it's cold, I work in the house before 8 in the morning or late at night. Sometimes I start at 11 p.m. and write until I drop, or I get up at 3 or 4 a.m. When it's light out, I type a first and final draft straight out of my head and hate revision. It's a painful experience. I'm not a born writer." For entertaining, Martha had to find a writer she could work with and control, another in that long line of bright, creative, non-confrontational people whom she seemed to draw to her. Enter her old friend, Elizabeth Hawes. After the Stewarts had moved to Westport, Martha and Hawes lost touch. However, around the same time Martha was thinking about entertaining, Hawes fortunately re-entered her life. We were actually broke, and we had all these babies, and we decided to leave the city, and Martha found us a house to rent in Westport, a very nice house right round the corner from her, and that is how we hooked up again. In early spring 1979, Martha approached Hawes with the book writing proposition. By then, Hawes had left the editorial staff of The New Yorker and was freelancing, mostly writing food recipes for magazines like Gourmet. Like Martha, she had never tackled a book before, but she was thrilled at the prospect and agreed to collaborate. Hawes called her literary agent, Roberta Pryor, at International Creative Management to negotiate a contract with Martha. Her thinking was, this is going to be a 50-50 deal. I called Martha Stewart, and she was appalled that I would want royalties for my client, Pryor disclosed years later. I said, Elizabeth is a good writer. She works very hard, and if you're going to sign a book contract and you're not going to write the book yourself, then you have to be prepared to pay somebody to write it, and they have to share in the proceeds. Martha said, talk to Andy. He complained and whined to me that Martha only got a 7% royalty on the book, and because of that, he and Martha wanted to pay Elizabeth a flat fee. I said, that's no reason why you should try to get an excellent New Yorker writer for a cheap amount of money. He wasn't very pleased. I told him that I couldn't tell my client to go ahead and write the book without sharing in the royalties, and he said, forget it. It's not going to happen. Pryor was suddenly out. Acting as his wife's agent, Davis Weinstock then spent weeks trying to hammer out an acceptable contract with Andy, who had a reputation in the publishing world as hard-nosed negotiator and businessman, despite his mild-mannered personal style. As Pryor put it later, Davis Weinstock found himself agreeing to things he shouldn't have agreed to, and they effed themselves. In the end, the Weinstocks agreed to a deal nowhere near the 50-50 arrangement that Liz Hawes had anticipated. Well, Martha made hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties on entertaining, and the book would catapult her career as America's diva of domesticity. Hawes earned only a few pennies on each book sold. As I recall, I got 0.5% of Martha's royalties and a writer's fee of something like $3,000, part up front and part on completion of the book, she said. And then I got a bonus of about $1,000 when we finished because I ended up doing a lot more work at the end because Martha wasn't around. Andy looks like a big teddy bear and has the physical presence of one. He's somebody that you feel extremely warm towards, but Andy is, for all his teddy bearishness, a very tough negotiator, a very tough soul, equally skilled as Martha at manipulation. Once the contract was signed, though, Hawes, who described herself as being by no means savvy, not aggressive by nature and rather trusting, took an optimistic approach to the project. I was sure everything would work out fine. Martha was my friend. We were doing this together. We were creating it together. There wasn't anything threatening about it. I didn't think we were playing hardball. The two novice authors began to meet almost every day, either in Martha's kitchen or in the Hawes'. Martha was excited, said Hawes, but she didn't seem to have any idea what the book would be about. We had no idea what we were doing. Really, truly, we were operating by the seats of our pants in the beginning. After floundering for a time, Martha began to reminisce about the Costyras and growing up in Netley, describing how her mother cooked and entertained. Hawes' ears pricked up, and she furiously scribbled detailed notes, never even considering using a tape recorder. Martha used the family stories as a jump-off point to discuss her own experiences as a hostess, caterer, and cook. She'd found her storyline, and it would become the motif of almost all of her future publishing endeavors. At the typewriter, Hawes wrote Martha's stories in a simple-to-read, easy-to-understand, chummy first-person style. Entertaining's first paragraph, for instance, begins, I grew up in a large family that always had guests. I loved the ease with which my mother added extra places, a big platter of vegetables, a special pie. Whether Martha was telling the truth about her family and her formative years in Nutley, or whether she was fantasizing, creating a myth, was not Hawes' concern. I did no research, the writer revealed. I didn't check the accuracy of truthfulness of any of the things Martha told me. She was totally in control of the story. To me, it all seemed rather folkloric, this big family and their Polish kitchen and the father's fruit trees outside and all those kids. Martha always put a good spin on things. In late 1981, Martha turned in the manuscript, which, besides Hawes' text, included hundreds of colored photographs, practically all taken by Andy, captions, and dozens of recipes. Carolyn Hart, the editor, had never done a cookbook before, and that fact had initially concerned Martha, who had never written one. Martha had told Hart that she didn't want entertaining to intimidate readers, and Hart had responded by telling Martha, "If you can make me understand it, you'll accomplish your goal." And Hart got entertaining with her first read of the manuscript. Hart's boss, Carol Southern, was equally overjoyed, attributing much of her acceptance of Martha's manuscript to Liz Hawes's writing skills. "We were just relieved when Liz's manuscript came in to have somebody that we didn't have to rewrite, that was literate, that had sentences that were well constructed," Southern said. "It was simple but eloquent. We didn't often see manuscripts that well written." At the top, Alan Merkin was elated too. "Liz did a great writing job," he declared. Despite all the kudos, Hawes, who was still recovering from the royalties mugging that she'd received at the hands of the Stewarts, was in for still another shock. When the galley proofs arrived, she saw for the first time that her name was not on the jacket. The cover was dominated by Martha Stewart, her byline, and a picture of her smiling hostess standing in front of a beautifully decorated dining room table. Equally disturbing to Hawes was the credit line on the first inside page that read, "By Martha Stewart, text with Elizabeth Hawes." Many co-writers, in fact, don't receive a writing credit, but Hawes, who had poured her heart and soul into the project and had always viewed Martha as a loyal friend, felt betrayed. "Martha did no writing for entertaining," Hawes declared. "She wasn't the author of entertaining. It was certainly her book, but it was my prose. But Martha didn't want to take any chances that she would be identified as other than the author. She wanted it to be her book." Confronting Martha, Hawes demanded that the credit "text with" should have been "text by." But Martha was immovable. She said, "That's the way it is." She argued that the use of the word "by" sounded like she didn't have anything to do with the text. She said the ideas were hers, and that she would look like the co-author if the word "by" was used. She said she was insecure about having people think that the book was ghostwritten. We argued. We went around and around, but by then it was too late. It was beyond disappointing for me to get up to publication and get a "thanks for the help" kind of thing when I considered myself a full collaborator. I was incredibly annoyed and was stomping around, talking to my husband and saying, "I can't believe that's happened." Hawes said that she didn't take legal action because Martha was a friend and we'd had a wonderful time doing this book. I sincerely expected that we'd have our arms around each other walking in the limelight together, but in the end I was left hurt and disbelieving that I was getting so little credit. Hawes took her complaints to Carol Southern and Carolyn Hart, but she was told that Martha was adamant and would accept no other wording than "text with." Southern advised Hawes, "You'd better give in." Later, Southern, who was given her own imprint at Crown, which had become a division of Random House, said Liz was the writer, no question. I remember thinking at the time, how clever of Martha to get a New Yorker writer. Nobody had ever done that for a cookbook. That was an original idea. In the end, Liz was sort of astonished at Martha's ambition. Martha has a way with people where she makes them feel important and that they're making a contribution. She can be very comfortable to be with, and I can imagine Liz going over there to work with her like pals together, and then suddenly Martha has walked off with the star billing. This is a really complicated thing, I think, because I feel like Liz's naivete was pretty enormous. I think she should have gone with what her actual literary agent suggested, that she not work with Martha, because when that agent was talking and hashing things out with Andy, it was clear that Andy was going to screw Liz over. But, Liz says, oh, Martha was just so out of control ambitious, which she was. But then Liz, too, was ambitious because then she gets her husband to step in there and hash things out with Andy. And he didn't have the know-how, the prowess to be having that kind of conversation with somebody like Andy, who was good at what he did and good at screwing people over to get the deal he wanted. So she had her own ambitions by not listening to somebody who told her, if you work with the Stewarts, you will be screwed over. You will. They do not want it to be fair, but she wanted her piece of this pie. And I can understand it. As a writer and thinking you'd have a chance at this big project, it would be hard to let it go. And it would be hard to believe that your friend would actually screw you over, So it'd be easy to think, well, you're just a literary agent. You don't really know Martha. I've known Martha for years. You're just taking this sort of cold business approach to it. And from a business perspective, you think it's not a good deal. But I know my friend wouldn't do this to me. So she walks into this thing very naive, but at what point did she think she was more than a ghostwriter? Had that ever been told to her, like, you're going to get equal billing? Why would you? You're definitely not making equal pay. This is not a 50-50 thing. Martha's getting 7% of royalties. You're getting half of 1% of that 7%? I mean, pennies. So I I understand that she all along believed it was one thing, and I think that she totally had blinders on, because I think she started out with blinders when she believed that she could get a good deal with Martha by having her husband and Andy negotiate. That was a I have my blinders on moment. And then I think all along through the project, she was seeing it for what she wanted it to be. This cool thing that she and her friend were doing, and they were, her famous friend and her were really going to make it big. But I don't know what Martha ever said to her to lead her to believe that, because Martha is really good at charming you in the moment to get what you want, but she also, I think, is real careful with her words so that you can never say, but you told me. She lets you believe all you want, but I don't know that Martha ever said, and I'm going to make sure that your name is on the byline with mine. I'm going to make sure that you get full credit. Your name's going to be in the title. I don't know that that was ever explicit. I just highly doubt Martha would have been explicit with that offering, because she wouldn't want it to come back and bite her, because she has every intention of taking Liz's talent, using, abusing, manipulating, and then running off into the sunset with all the cash. Okay. We have one more chapter. It's entitled Author. Entertaining had an initial press run of 25,000 copies and a cover price of $35, both extraordinarily big numbers for a cookbook at the time. They were very cautious about the number of books printed, Martha noted. The first printing, I think it was 25,000 copies, and I was sort of disappointed, and my husband thought I was nuts. He said that is an enormous amount for a first book. Martha had been asking for a first printing of 35 to 40,000 copies. In the end, she was on the mark because the demand was bigger than the initial supply. As Carol Southern remembered, Martha was always pushing us to a point where we were a little nervous. She just would persist and say, I really want this, I really want that. Entertaining was a first in that it was a really expensive color book. We were terribly worried that it was too expensive and that no one would pay that kind of money for it. Everybody was very nervous about it because nobody knew who Martha Stewart was. We went out on a limb with Martha. The Stewarts both were perfectionists, and they wanted a perfect first book for Martha, so they demanded quality. One of the things that Andy noticed was that a tablecloth wasn't colored exactly in the book as it was at home, Ellen Merkin pointed out, as an example of the Stewarts' vigilance. But nobody else knew that. It looked very nice in the book, but Andy knew it wasn't the right color. It wasn't like we were printing a Monet art piece that had to match exactly. It was just a tablecloth that was very pretty either way. He gave us his input. They both did. And that was fine. But we did what we felt we had to do. About a month before Entertaining's publication date, Martha began pestering Andy to help her plan and produce the enormous launch party, which would be held at Turkey Hill and catered, of course, by Martha and paid for by her publisher. But Andy was resisting Martha's nagging. After a phenomenal 5-year run as president and CEO of Harry Abrams, he had decided to give up his prestigious, powerful, and well-paid position to start his own high-quality illustrated book publishing house, Stewart, DeBory, and Chang. Martha was vehemently against Andy's decision, seeing it as a big gamble which she didn't believe he could handle. Andy had to borrow about $1 million to start the company. Martha saw wings on the money. Andy was now working even longer hours than before, trying to get his first small list of books published. Curiously, his lead title was an elegant, sumptuously photographed book, much like Entertaining, called Glorious Foods, by Christopher Iden, a prominent Manhattan caterer who had a roster, like Martha, of rich and famous clients. Like Martha's, Iden's books were scheduled for the fall of 1982. Andy was not only guiding Martha's book, but also overseeing one that would be in direct competition with hers. Martha had mixed feelings about the conflict. On the one hand, she hoped Glorious Foods would do well, giving Stewart's new venture a shot in the arm and enriching the Stewart's bank account. On the other hand, she was worried that Iden's work would cut into Entertaining sales and her glory and her fame. Martha and Andy, it appeared, wanted it both ways. As the publication date of Entertaining drew near, Martha became more stressed, anxious, and on edge. Her future, she accurately felt, was riding on what would happen in the coming weeks. She continued to beseech Andy to take time off to help her with last-minute preparations for her big book party. One evening, about a week and a half before the bash, Martha's appeals went over the edge. Andy and Martha, along with a young son of a colleague of Andy's, were returning to Westport after having had dinner in Manhattan. It was about midnight, and they're heading outbound on the Bruckner Expressway, passing through the South Bronx. Martha wanted Andy to take a week off to assist with the preparations for the garden party for Entertaining, and Andy told her he could only spare a couple of days because he had important business at Stewart, DeBory, and Chang, a confidant stated. Martha can get really livid if you don't do what she wants. And she got really livid, and she said, if you don't promise you'll do it, I'm going to open this car and jump out. And Andy said, I just can't. And Martha opened the car door. They were at a ramp, and Andy grabbed Martha's arm and braked, but she jumped out while the car was still slowly rolling and ran down the ramp into this horrible neighborhood, which was like Bonfire of the Vanities territory. It was a very dangerous spot, and it was late at night, and it was a very, very unpleasant situation. Andy had to get out of the car and chase Martha and plead with her to get a hold of herself and get back in the car and out of the street, which she eventually did after much coaxing. Remember, by the way, they have the young son of a colleague in the car with them during this tumultuous marital episode. Later, I said to Andy, that's why Martha's the way that she is today. You should have just let her run into the Bronx. And he said, she would have gotten hurt. And I said, but you never allow her to suffer the consequences of one single thing she ever does. Martha does whatever it takes to get what she wants, and that can involve some pretty strange behavior. She could have gotten killed that night. Martha's actions didn't come as a complete surprise to Andy and to the friends that he later told about the incident. During the years of the Stewarts' marriage, Martha occasionally threatened suicide if she didn't get her way, and Andy always gave in. Martha's tantrum in the Bronx worked. Andy gave her the time that she required, and her book party came off as planned. It was a glorious and glittering affair in the inimitable Martha Stewart fashion. Tables were filled with beautiful food, there was a barbecue, bottles of the dessert wine, du Bonnet Blanc were everywhere because earlier in the year, Martha had become the U.S. spokesperson for the company, her first product endorsement, which was short-lived. Crown's publicity department had sent out the invitations, and top editors and business executives were on hand from Crown, Clarkson, Potter, and other major houses, congratulating Martha on her fine writing job and her creativity. Key executives from Dalton, Walton, and the book clubs also were in attendance to celebrate Entertaining's publication. Martha Stewart smiled and sparkled and looked like the happiest and proudest woman in the world that night. She was the star, the center of attention, the newly crowned lifestyle queen at her coronation. At least for that brief, joyous moment, she appeared content. Everywhere there were piles of her dazzling book, which was dedicated to Lexi, to Eddie Costira, and to Andy, for his encouragement, good nature, and support. But there was something surreal about the evening, according to Norma Collier, whose on-again, off-again friendship with Martha was briefly on-again. Andy and I were walking the paths of the garden, and people were coming up to him and saying, "Oh, Andy, congratulations, the book is so wonderful. You must be very proud of Martha." And he was smiling and saying, "Oh, thank you, I am proud of her." And then we'd walk on and he'd whisper to me, "I gotta get out of here. I gotta leave her. I just can't live like this anymore." And I thought, oh God, this is like a Fellini movie. Friends, Romans, countrymen, what have we heard in our ears? This girl's crazy. This girl's crazy. And you guys, I just can't wait till we get to this part where, because it's mounting tension with her and Andy, if you haven't been able to tell yet. And there's a scene, I think it's coming up in our next reading, I could be wrong, but it's coming up, where she is so controlling of Andy, which we saw in this chapter with her making him mix eggs at the party for his book, and where he's trying to start a new business, but she's like, "You're going to need to take a week off because I'm going to need you. I'm going to need to make sure that you're mowing the lawn for our party." She's constantly, anytime he has a win, she's constantly trying to rope him back in to serve her as she continues on one of her wins. It's disgusting behavior, but we're going to see her control everything he does. Every little step that Andy makes in life, Martha's on top of him. And it all comes down to, he needs to be in my service. I need to make sure he's doing things for me. He doesn't need to run off and have any independence unless it's going to earn us some money. If it's going to make our bank account a little fatter, then maybe. But other than that, no. She's obnoxious. And there's this story that we're going to read. I don't want to tell it to you now because I want you guys to get it in its full glory then. I was floored that she could treat him like this and that this was the expected behavior. Their relationship is one of the most interesting parts of this book, and the revelations are just getting better and better and better and more detailed about the way that she mistreats him. Not just calling him stupid, not just embarrassing him in front of others, not even just making him mix eggs at a party he's supposed to be attending and hobnobbing at. No. She has just dug her claws into that man, and he is paralyzed with fear of her. Such a weird and interesting study, those two. So, join me again next time. We'll see each other on Monday for more episodes of the Martha Stewart book. But before that, we'll see each other on Friday for the Friday News Roundup. And then, of course, on Sunday for our Martha book, for our Margaret Trudeau book. See you then. Bye.